On this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast, I interview Seth Thomas, who is an associate researcher at the Nature Based Solutions Initiative at the University of Oxford. On today's episode, we talk about what exactly are nature based solutions and what roles they play in tackling the climate and biodiversity crisis while alleviating poverty. We also talk about all the work Seth has done in terms of studying nature regeneration, large carnivore rewilding, and the sustainable use of wildlife. Tune into this episode and don't forget to share and subscribe to the Think Wildlife podcast.
My first question is, in a nutshell, what are nature-based solutions and what role do they play in tackling the planetary crisis?
Yeah, so nature-based solutions are when you work with ecosystems, often forms of ecosystem management, regeneration, or protection, in a way that you're using them to address societal challenges. So that kind of aligns really well with pre-planetary crises. A lot of societal challenges come from things like climate change, biodiversity loss, or pollution, but it can be way broader than that. And so these nature-based solutions often are trying to both benefit biodiversity and benefit these local communities. And it's a way of using these ecosystem services in many cases to kind of help tackle these. So for examples from the planetary crises, just to underpin nature-based solutions, they have to be biodiversity positive. So working with ecosystems and not damaging them. So helping protect biodiversity in that local context. Nature-based solutions for climate change are probably actually the most famous that people generally think of when they think of nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions are really important in both climate mitigation and adaptation. So on the mitigation side is probably what most people jump to immediately. It's things like planting forests for trees or seagrass carbon sequestration or sequestration from regenerating natural ecosystems or grasslands and all sorts of those different things to capture carbon. But with that biodiversity lens on it, it's making sure that you're not planting monocultures, that you're not planting non-native species, that you're doing it in a way that supports both biodiversity and that societal carbon goal. In terms of adaptation, it can be adapting to extreme weather, things like droughts or flooding or coastal inundation. So there's a lot of really diverse ways that that can look. And there's also a lot of nature-based solutions focused on agriculture. So that kind of gets into that pollution lens of the planetary crises. So you can have nature-based solutions which are really working towards limiting the use of pesticides or chemical fertilizers or preventing those from running off into our rivers and streams. So there's a lot of different ways that nature-based solutions can be designed for all of these different societal crises. And there's a really kind of broad spectrum look that can be taken when you're seeing all of the different interventions that people can design.
So how do local communities benefit?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that local communities can benefit from nature-based solutions. Sometimes it's really direct. So if you're working on agroforestry systems, if you're working on natural pest management systems, a lot of times these are things that can help directly increase the yields of the crops that communities rely on or diversify the crops that communities rely on in order to give them greater levels of economic security. But it can also be kind of indirect in a lot of different ways. In some cases, these communities rely on tourism really heavily and through nature regeneration or climate adaptation in many cases, where a lot of these ecosystems are really vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They're able to use nature-based solutions to kind of help protect the natural world and that tourism resource that's really beneficial to them, especially in a lot of coastal and marine nature-based solutions as well. We see that protecting ecosystems or helping regenerate ecosystems for things like coastal defenses or regenerating salt marshes or mangroves actually has cascading benefits to things like local fisheries. So allowing local fishermen to have increased fishing yields or have more stable fishing yields throughout the year. So nature-based solutions are really place-based and really kind of specific to their local context. So because their general applicability is really broad, that community benefit looks really different depending on the makeup of that individual community and kind of what that community is looking for. In a lot of cases, you're working with Indigenous and local communities, and to them, there's a massive cultural value in some of these landscapes. So helping these cultural landscapes adapt to the impacts of climate change is another really big asset that nature-based solutions can provide.
What exactly is community-based conservation? And secondly, can you talk about your work?
Yeah, so community-based conservation can look like a lot of different things around the globe. In the case of Tanzania, it's mainly through wildlife management areas in one case. So community-based conservation is generally trying to be community-centered initiatives for conservation, but also hoping to have some sort of localized economic benefits or localized benefits from those conservation outcomes. So in the case of wildlife management areas in Tanzania, local villages are choosing to put a portion of their land under protection as a protected area, and then using that protected area as a space where they can sell tourism licenses or game reserve licenses. And so by protecting wildlife, they're hoping to bring industries to their local communities. Because in a lot of different countries, how that kind of national park revenue works. So Tanzania has a ton of really famous national parks like Serengeti or Tarangire. And that revenue goes to the federal government, but the communities don't necessarily, while they do receive a lot of benefits from the revenue, it's not going directly into that local community. So through these kind of community-based landscape protection organization initiatives, all of the money generated by the wildlife management areas then goes back into the community. And so when I was working in Tanzania, we were kind of trying to study and see if these areas were actually as good at protecting animals as national parks, because it is a very large promise that you're making to these communities that if they just set aside a little bit of land, that it can regenerate and have all of the animals and all of the things that people want to see on a safari. And so we were actually trying to test and implement and see if that worked. And so we compared the Burunge Wildlife Management Area with Tarangire National Park, and we were able to show similar levels of species diversity and density, which is both really good in a conservation outcome, showing that these community conservancies work just as well as national parks to protect different wildlife species, but it's also really good for those communities because it shows that these wildlife management areas can provide just as enriching and interesting wildlife landscapes for people to visit and tour and spend their money at as national parks do. And so it's kind of a twofold outcome that was really great. There are still limitations for these wildlife management areas in the sense that Burunge, which is our study site, is part of that northern tourist circuit. And some of these wildlife management areas are further away from kind of those main tourist destinations. They're definitely something that people should be looking at and being interested in as they're kind of going to these a lot of really touristic destinations that are wildlife centric, is looking at what kind of wildlife areas they can experience that are most supporting local communities.
So coming back to nature-based solutions, what are some of the main challenges with implementing nature-based solutions and also involving local communities in conservation?
Yeah, I think that that's a challenge that kind of conservation as a whole always struggles with a bit on more broadly. And I think it's making sure that nature-based solutions kind of at their core are very grounded in a place. And so making sure that when you're working in that place, you're integrating traditional ecological knowledge, you're having free, prior, and informed consent, or collaborating with local Indigenous communities, and kind of with that collaborative atmosphere, making sure that you're implementing these solutions that are both desired by the community, but under the guidance of the community. So in many cases, if your goal is something such as a forest restoration, it is going to be local communities that actually understand what that forest is supposed to look like, what kind of native species are there. It's also collaborating with those communities to know that it's kind of going beyond just planting some trees, right? It's knowing that there are also traditional herbs or berries or other important food sources that are connected to that forest. And how do we restore this, not as just carbon sequestration mechanism, but as a biodiverse landscape that can both provide for its community and help increase biodiversity locally. And so that's a big issue. There's another issue with kind of people's focus on carbon mitigation. And oftentimes they're really just honing in on the idea that like we should plant trees, capture carbon, and move on. And I think in reality, it's understanding those local landscapes again in that context of knowing that things like trees aren't actually the right solution everywhere. Maybe this is naturally a grassland. Maybe this is naturally a savanna or a wetland. And by preserving that ecosystem as what it's supposed to be, we can help increase the biodiversity value and help kind of honor what it was to a lot of local communities previously. And so I think it's kind of incorporating both local knowledge and kind of scientific knowledge and making sure that we're not necessarily blinded by this drive going on or different fads that might be arising in nature conservation, such as tree planting, which always sounds really great and is something we should support. But we should support it in a biodiverse and locally inclusive way.
Continuing with nature-based solutions, so you are a research assistant at the University of Oxford's Nature-Based Institute. Could you just talk about what this Nature-Based Institute is about?
Yeah, so the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative is led by Professor Natalie Seddon here, And I think it originally came out of when nature-based solutions as a term was kind of arising. It was kind of a little bit loosely defined. And I know as I was talking about it today, even it seems quite broad in a lot of the scope that it covers. But I think a lot of it was coming in, how do we define this term and how do we also create positive change for good in a world that is both focused on biodiversity, but also local communities and addressing the challenges that those local communities face? Because when you take a finer grain look at it, you can see that actually in many instances, the best interests for nature and the best interests of the community really do align. And a lot of those previous ecosystem services and the things that nature provided for us have kind of been destroyed or taken away. And we can use those over a lot of times great infrastructure solutions as really resilient and diverse ways to kind of tackle modern challenges. So the Institute kind of works, or the initiative kind of works together to look at all the different ways that nature-based solutions can be implemented around the world. What does it look like to have good practice, but also making sure that we call out when people are using nature-based solutions but aren't actually implementing nature-based solutions. So when are they not being biodiverse? When are they not being inclusive of local communities and Indigenous people? And making sure that we hold nature-based solutions to a high standard so that they're able to deliver the benefits that we know that they can.
So can you talk a bit about your work doing at a nature-based solution institute?
Yeah, so at the initiative, I work a lot on our global mapping project. So we have a global map of over 150 case studies around the world of nature-based solutions implemented in all different contexts and cultural environments and all different types of societal issues they're trying to address. Because there's definitely a lot that we can learn from each other in terms of how we implement nature-based solutions. And as I was saying, they're all really place-based. And so people come up with really amazing, innovative solutions to challenges that their local communities are facing. And it can be everything from using oyster shells from local oyster restaurants to help build back natural oyster reefs as flood protections, to coral reef restorations, to cocoa agroforestry, to tons of different things. And it's really inspiring to see all of the different ways that people can kind of work on that. So through that global mapping project that I work on, we kind of classify a lot of these different things, look at a lot of the different shared impacts they might have or different ecosystems they work in, and then provide it as kind of an information sharing platform for people to refer to and look at different solutions that people have implemented across the globe.
You are also working at nature-based in setting on a few nature regeneration projects. So firstly, can you talk about your work and also what is the difference between nature regeneration, restoration, and rewilding?
Yeah, so first a little bit on my work. So in nature-based insetting, I work a lot on metrics and measuring how do we actually try to quantify the impacts that nature regeneration is trying to have. Because we do promise a lot of impacts in nature regeneration, whether that's for local communities, local economies, or local biodiversity. And there's so many different ways to measure all of those things. So at nature-based insetting, I kind of work on collating different metrics in ways that we can measure this and kind of providing them in a context that different project users can kind of look at which ones might best fit their individual scenarios. And so trying to have sort of baseline measurements that people can use to try and see how their nature regeneration projects are working, because it's really important to kind of measure these different interventions, because in some cases we might be getting the benefits that we really want. But I think even more importantly, it's really important to know when benefits that we think are happening, such as certain types of biodiversity outcomes or certain types of social or economic outcomes are not happening. And you need to know that something isn't meeting the standard that you want in order to be able to address it and kind of change your projects in order to make sure they're the most beneficial that they can possibly be. In terms of nature regeneration versus restoration versus rewilding, I think in a theoretical level, I think it's very easy, or not easy to parse them out, but I think on the ground, it's kind of very similar. I think a lot of it has to do with how do you frame it in a context that it makes local people excited to work on these projects, that frame it in a context that makes kind of the most sense when you're talking about it. Or honestly, I would say it's probably a lot coming from the ground up. So if the local community wants a rewilding project or nature restoration or nature regeneration, I think you should listen to the local community. But in terms of maybe how I would parse it a little bit in my mind, even though I think they're all really similar, rewilding as it's pitched mainly is very species specific. So it's a lot about what is the impact that returning beavers or large herbivores to a landscape can have, versus regeneration is a bit more passive in the sense that you still have a lot of nearby trees and plants that can kind of help you naturally regenerate. And I view restoration as a bit more active. You may no longer have the seed base or the plants that you need nearby. So you have to make an active choice to be bringing those plants in to help restore that landscape.
Talking about rewilding, you have done quite a bit of work on studying global carnivore reintroduction. Could you just talk about the two papers you recently published about?
Yeah, so we had a recent paper come out on global large carnivore reintroductions and translocations. So that work was kind of grounded in the idea that there's a lot of conversations going on right now about how do we reintroduce carnivores places, or in some cases, how do we reinforce populations? So when populations are really small, how do we add genetic diversity to those so that they have a chance to thrive? And in the case of large carnivores, these are often some of the most endangered species in the world. They exist in really low numbers in a lot of different landscapes. And they're also central to a lot of different types of human-wildlife conflict. And so when you're moving one to a new location, I think it takes a lot of thought in the background of it. And in our case, we really wanted to focus in on the actual survivorship of those animals, because in many cases, in many of these species, each individual is really important. So making sure what is the best way that we can try to look for them surviving or ensure that they survive. So what we did is we collected a global data set of different large carnivore translocations all around the world, where people were releasing them, and we looked at different practices they used when releasing them. So things like how old are the animals that they're selecting to release? Are they doing a soft release or a hard release? Where a soft release is you're letting the animal acclimate in a holding pen for a few days to a month or two, versus a hard release is you just get it to the new location and let it go. Things like, does the animal's gender matter for its success? If it's being released into a fenced or an unfenced reserve, does it matter for its success? And we kind of took all of that in aggregate and we're able to analyze kind of what those outcomes were. And the good news is that compared to a previous study, which had done something similar, we found about a pretty significant increase in that outcome. But the bad news is that increase still does only come up to about a 66% survival rate after 6 months after release. So 2/3 of the carnivores survive, which is a massive improvement now. But we still have to be really conscious of the fact that only 2/3 of them are surviving. So it kind of puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that we need to make sure that we're doing due diligence and collaborating with local communities and making sure that these landscapes are ready for large carnivores to be released into them. Because if they're not ready, there's already so many other factors that might be working against them that we don't want to tip those odds anymore against the carnivore's favor.
You also worked at the IUCN studying the legal wildlife trade and its socioeconomic impact. So after COVID, where there's been a lot of focus on the illegal wildlife trade, why do you think the legal wildlife trade is a necessity?
Yeah, so in terms of legal wildlife trade and whether it's necessary or unnecessary, there's definitely, in the context of CITES, which is the global body that governs trade in endangered species, a lot of their basis on trade is looking at species who are covered and are they endangered? Do they need to be on this list? In which case, they're generally quite good at putting them on the list. But there's lots of species in the world whose populations are relatively stable or in some cases actually growing. And so there's not necessarily an incentive to regulate their international trade. And so also in terms of that, it comes a lot down to local community wildlife management. And for example, here in the UK, no one necessarily says that we shouldn't have our red deer be exported or our grouse exported. And there would definitely be people lobbying to change how we manage those practices. But I think a lot of the narrative surrounding legal wildlife trade seems very prescriptive from a Western lens onto communities, who this is kind of their natural resource. This is their local wildlife. And just because their local wildlife looks different than our local wildlife here in the UK, I think they have the feeling that they can treat it differently. And I don't think that's the case. And in cases where we know that species are abundant and are not threatened directly by trade, if communities are utilizing this legal wildlife resource that they have, it actually is incentivizing them in many cases to help conserve this wildlife and help support it, because it's an important economic resource to them locally. And so there are cases where you actually see that when legal wildlife trade in a species is legalized and allowed to happen, that the community both increases its socioeconomic benefits from this, so supporting local livelihoods, but also the populations of these traded species will increase as well. And I think what's actually the most important part of it is recognizing that this trade goes on and making sure that we study it really closely. And so making sure that we're looking at the trade and trying to understand when does this trade maybe cross a threshold into not being sustainable, when does the trade cross a threshold into being actually super sustainable and it's fine, like making sure that everything is kind of working and processing really well. And one last thing that I'd add on this is I think in terms of the wildlife trades that are actually often quite negative are trades that are very just normalized in Western cultures. So for example, sturgeon trade and caviar. There's a lot of evidence that the sturgeon trade, even though it's legal because it's been blocked by certain countries from being banned internationally, even though that the caviar trade is legal, there are still a lot of really massive issues in it and a lot of like reasons that we should be investigating it further versus we kind of demonize some of these trades coming from the global south in cases where they're actually really sustainable and supporting local species. So I think it kind of just requires a lot of reframing over how we view legal wildlife trade, but also supporting local communities to make decisions over their own wildlife.
My final question for you today is that what do you think is the future of nature-based solutions, and how do you think nature-based solutions can be improved, have a greater impact on conservation?
Yeah, so in terms of what the future of nature-based solutions and how they can be improved, I think one of the really important steps coming forward right now is that the United Nations Environmental Assembly is working together to decide on an implementation framework for nature-based solutions. So I think it's really important to have kind of a clear floor and baseline for what something needs to be called a nature-based solution. As I mentioned a bit earlier, it's really important to call out things that are saying they're nature-based solutions but are actually being either harmful to nature or harmful to local communities, because then in that case, it is not a nature-based solution. And so I think we need to come together around a really common understanding of these solutions need to be biodiverse and they need to be actively involving local communities in a way that gives them kind of a lot of input and control over these types of solutions. And so I think having that globally agreed upon implementation for framework is a really important step, and making sure that nature-based solutions around the world are implemented with a lot more clarity and transparency and kind of common guidelines in order to uphold that high standard.